He was a boy in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in yet another village, where up until he was 30, he worked in a carpenter's shop. And then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a big house. He never went to college or university. In fact, he never traveled more than 250 kilometers from the place he was born. He did none of the things that you or I would usually associate with greatness. And he had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away and he was nailed to a cross between two thieves. As he was dying, the executioners, they gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he's a central figure of the human race. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as Jesus Christ. Socrates and Aristotle, they taught for 40 years, and Plato taught for 50. But Jesus taught for 3. Yet the influence of Christ's 3-year ministry, it far outweighs that of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato combined. Jesus, he painted no pictures, yet some of the finest paintings of Raphael and Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, well, they received their inspiration from him. Jesus, he wrote no poetry, but Dante, Milton, and scores of the world's greatest poets, well, they were inspired by him. Jesus wrote no songs, yet Handel, Beethoven, Bach, Mendelssohn, well, they reached their highest perfection of melody in the symphonies and the songs they composed in his praise. All you have to do is look around and realize that every single sphere of human greatness has been enriched by this humble carpenter from Nazareth. Jesus, indisputably the most famous, the most influential person to ever walk the earth. But is he still famous? Isn't it funny how we can be so distracted in life that we often fail to see what's right in front of us? For me, that's where Open Doors comes into it. We work with people that prove that not only is Jesus still famous today, but that more than 2,000 years on, his message of unity, it still divides the world. It instills fear in political powers and regimes, and at whose name alone people all over the world, they suffer pain, humiliation, and grief. I want to tell you a story today about a girl that Open Doors has been working with, a girl that knows that Jesus is still famous today. Her name is Susan. She's 14 years old and she's from Uganda. Susan, well, she comes from a staunchly Islamic home. Her father is a high-ranking police officer. One day when Susan was going to school, well, a visiting preacher came along and he spoke about a guy called Jesus who claimed to be the Son of God. At the end of his talk, he asked students, well, if you'd like to give your life to Jesus, please put your hand up. And Susan responded. That day, she gave her life to Christ. That afternoon, she went home and she told her father about her decision to follow Jesus. He was furious. He grabbed Susan and a younger brother. He dragged them outside, called all the neighbors around. He held a knife to her throat and said, Susan, if you keep following this guy called Jesus, I'm going to kill you and your brother. Her father dragged her back inside. He took her to a room in the house. He placed a mat made out of banana leaves on the floor. He forced Susan to sit on the mat and he said, "Susan, you do not leave that mat until you're willing to deny Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior." Susan's father locked the door and left. In fact, the only way that she would survive was that while her father was at work or out, her younger brother would dig a hole under the door in the dirt floor. He would pour water into it for Susan to lap up like a cat. And on occasion, when he had time, a younger brother would fry up some banana and slide that under the door for her to eat. Susan's father, he didn't return to that room for 3 months. 3 months. Anyway, after 3 months, the neighbours said to the brother, "Well, where's your sister? We haven't seen her." And he told them. They called the police. The police came and they opened the door, and there was Susan. She was sitting on the mat. In fact, the bones in her legs, they'd grown and conformed to the way she'd been sitting. Her hair had turned yellow because of a lack of sunlight, and she weighed 20 kilos. They picked her up and rushed her to hospital. It's where open doors bumped into her. I'm sure you can imagine one of the first questions we asked Susan was, "Well, when your father was out, why didn't you try and escape?" And without missing a beat, Susan said, "Because my father said if I was to leave that mat, I'd be denying Jesus, and I could never do that." You talk about courage, you talk about faith, you talk about trust in Jesus or a belief in Jesus. Well, Susan has all of that. And today, what I want to do for us, I want to share 2 lessons that we can learn from Susan's story. And the first lesson is this: you can't be passionate for Jesus and not suffer for him. Think about that. You can't be passionate for Jesus and not suffer for him. When I look around society and culture today, well, especially in the church, I think the word passion is probably one of the most misused words in our Christian vocabulary. Everyone keeps talking about passion. You'll hear people say, "Man, look how passionate they are," or "Wow, you can just tell they're passionate about it." These statements, they're often used about people's love for sporting teams, maybe how passionately they sing, how excited they are. And I think that's the thing, is that if we're honest with ourselves, we kind of replace the word excitement with the word passion. But there is a big problem in doing this, because the origin of the word passion comes from the Latin word for suffering. So it means that passion is less about how excited you can get about something and more about your willingness to suffer for something you love. It starts to make the idea of the passion of the Christ make so much more sense. Jesus' willingness to suffer for you and I because he was passionate for us. More than that, the Bible clearly says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12 that everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. That means that you, I, everyone who wants to follow Jesus will ultimately be persecuted for it. So let me ask you, when was the last time you were persecuted for following Jesus? Susan knows it all too well. Immediately after making the decision to follow Jesus, she was persecuted. So the first lesson is this: if you want to make Jesus famous again, you need to realize that suffering will be part of that journey. It's part and parcel of the Christian walk. You cannot follow Jesus authentically and courageously and not expect to suffer for him. And the second lesson today that we can learn from Susan is that the best way to make Jesus famous is to make it part of your purpose. Let me ask you, in 10 years' time, what will you be doing? Seriously, think about it for a moment. If you're 14, you'll be 24. What job will you have? Where will you be working? In 10 years' time, what will you be doing? It's an interesting question, right? I mean, for some people, it's probably a pretty terrifying question. But for me, the reality of a question like that is it's about purpose. It's a question that strikes at the heart of things like self-belief, value, belonging, and ultimately safety. And my guess is that some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm not sure that God actually has a purpose for my life. In fact, I'm not even sure God cares about me, because if you knew my past, you knew the things I've done, then there is no way a God could care for me. But I want you to know something. God is not worried about your past. He cares about your future. In fact, if there is one thing that you can take away from this talk today, one thing, you're writing it down, taking notes, this is it. I want you to commit it to memory, and I want you to live by it every day. The reality is this: the past should never determine our present. The present, the here and now, what's happening today, it should only ever be determined by the future. We should respect, acknowledge, honor the past, but we should be driven by the future, a picture of who we can become in Jesus. I'm going to say it again. Remember, this is the key point. If you're taking notes, I want you to remember this. The past should never determine your present. The present, the here and now, should always be determined by the future. We should respect and acknowledge our past, not hide from it. But we should be driven by the future. But here's one of the most incredible things about Jesus. He's focused on our future, and he never holds our past against us. But rather he uses it. He uses all of the ups and the downs, the ins and the outs. He uses it for his glory, and he'll do the same in your life too. I can't think of a better example from the Bible than Saul, probably one of the most feared guys. I mean, he was renowned for torturing, for bullying, for harassing, and for hurting Christians. I guess there is literally no other word in, society and culture today other than terrorist. Saul, was a terrorist. The way he persecuted Christians was ferocious. But then, on the road to Damascus, a blinding light comes, calls his name, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Here it is, one of the greatest terrorists in the history of the world. In that moment, Jesus, forgetting his past and seeing his future, calls to him. He calls him by name. And notice this. The scriptures say, Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He didn't say, Saul, why are you hurting Christians? Jesus directly said Paul's actions were hurting Jesus, which means that Jesus takes the persecution of Christians personally. Purpose. God can use our past, our present, and our future for his glory. As we get ready to wrap up today, I want to finish by telling you my story. Because I was abandoned at birth in India. In fact, I was born as a Hindu, not a Christian. Born as a Hindu and left for dead in India. From what I know, my biological mother had fallen pregnant with me when she was unmarried. And within the Hindu caste system, that's a very insulting thing to have happen. And she abandoned me, left me for dead. I was found and placed into an orphanage, but again, because of the Hindu caste system, they believed that what I had done in my previous life must have been so terrible that it had meant that I'd been abandoned at birth. And because of that, I was declared what you call a Dalit and unable to be adopted. In 1977, many years ago now, a family in Australia, they applied for an adoption. They had 2 biological daughters of their own. They were a Christian family. And they heard a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, a lot of reasons why it couldn't happen. And after 4 years in 1981, when I was born, after 4 years of trying, they gave up on adopting a child. They decided to spend the money they had saved on a trip to America with their 2 biological daughters, a way of kind of moving on and closing the chapter of that part of their life. Anyway, while this was happening, a lady in the orphanage that was looking after me took a liking to me. One night, under the cover of darkness, she grabbed me. She smuggled me across a state line where she bribed some nuns with cash to say that I was dumped on their doorstep and asked them to change my birth certificate. Because she knew that if my birth certificate got changed, I could be adopted under that state's law. And so the nuns changed the certificate. The family who had gone to America returned, and they got a phone call saying the adoption had gone through, and more than that, your son would be at Sydney Airport at the weekend, 3 or 4 days away. Don't know about you, but that was a pretty terrifying thing for them. They're a Christian family. They prayed about it that night. And the next day, as my mum that was driving with her 2 biological daughters in the car, she had a car crash, wrote the car off without a scratch or a bruise to anyone. But then she tells me, Mike, what was a miracle was that 2 days later, the day before you arrived in Sydney, the insurance money had returned to her bank account. And more than that, it was to the exact dollar that was needed to pay for my adoption. Not $1 more and not $1 less. See, before I even knew Jesus, he had a purpose and plan for my life. And I believe it's the same for you. He saw me abandoned at birth in India, and I want you to know that he sees you. And as I said before, and more than that, not only does he see you, he cares for you, and he has a purpose and plan for your life. A plan that ultimately results in making Jesus famous. Your past, it doesn't determine your future. And today is a day for change. It's a day where everything changes, where the bully goes from being a Saul to a Paul, where people who were bullied find purpose and they go from a place of disillusionment to a life of purpose, where we both say, we're not worried about our past, we're driven by the future. Jesus, he's not made up. He's real. The greatest minds in the world acknowledge that. I mean, the greatest superpowers are terrified by that. He's a living God who walked the earth and who today walks the earth through his Spirit. Our purpose, it shouldn't be based off a set of rules, expectations, or buzzwords created by the people around us, telling us whether we're cool or whether we're uncool. It should be defined by Jesus, who walked with broken people, ate with sinners, loved the unlovable. He met with the rich and he met with the poor. He led with a character and set of principles that he wouldn't compromise for anyone. He doesn't care about brand, fashion label, number of friends on Facebook, followers on Instagram, and he wasn't worried about looking cool if saying no meant the right outcome was achieved. And on top of all of that, he loved a dying and broken world with a passion that couldn't be fueled, stopped, or watered down or contained. And ultimately, he laid down his life so that you and me, a sinful, broken, and dislocated group of people, could find eternal life through him. It's this Jesus that has a purpose and a plan for our lives. All we have to do is look around the world to see that it acknowledges Jesus in every sense of the word. We've got Christmas because of Jesus. We've got Easter because of Jesus. We measure time, BC and AD, because of Jesus. The word eternity, if you truly think about it, has no foundation outside of heaven, because nothing scientists have found in all of creation, moon, stars, universe, nothing lasts for eternity other than heaven. Jesus is either the greatest lie in the history of the world, a lie that has convinced political leaders, musicians, artists, kings, rulers, business people, university scholars, academics, you name it, the list could go on for hours, or it is real. The God of creation has a purpose and a plan for our lives. The worst of us and the best of us, loved by God, created for His glory. Take it from me, a kid left for dead, smuggled across borders, suffering racism and bullying pretty much my whole life. What I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt is all I have to do is look back to India. Before I even knew Him, God had a purpose and plan for my life. I'm not going to let the past determine my present. I'm going to be driven by the future, realizing and looking to people like Susan and learning that there is so much to be learned. There's so much to do and to grow and to follow with Jesus. How do we make Him famous again? We choose to live for Him no matter the cost, just like Susan did. We realize that to follow Him means we will experience persecution, and in the middle of that, we will find purpose, comfort, and help. Because following Jesus is neither safe, comfortable, or easy, but it is always purposeful. Because remember, before we were passionate for Him, He suffered because of His passion for us. God bless you. I hope your conference goes great. It is a wonderful privilege to be with you. And from all of us here in Australia, we love you guys and keep following Jesus. Hold on to everything loosely but Him. God bless.